Diplomacy has failed. The sword must now preserve our independence. Fort Sumter failed to be evacuated by the Confederate deadline, and 6,000 Southerners now have Charleston Harbor completely surrounded. Cannon and mortar stare down the fort, and at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a gunner at Fort Johnson sets off a 10-inch mortar. The explosive shoots into the early morning skies above Fort Sumter, its detonation lighting up the blue and telling all those around one definitive thing: the Civil War has begun. As the men of Fort Sumter scurry to prepare, local citizens clamber to rooftops in hopes of watching the monumental battle occur. One by one, the Confederates begin firing upon the Union-held fort until every available cannon and mortar across the harbor is bombarding Sumter. The scarcely staffed Union garrison fires back as best they can, but with little manpower and cartridges, not much can be done. The Confederates are unrelenting. The attack continues into the following day, at one point setting the roof of the fort ablaze, but its defenders refuse to come out. Still, so impressed by the stubborn valor of their foes, the Confederates even begin to cheer for each shot fired from the fort. But this is far from enough to stop the South. In the early afternoon of April 13, the flagpole holding up the Union flag of Fort Sumter is hit and broken. Following a chaotic period of diplomatic negotiations, it is agreed that the Union troops will evacuate. Firing a salute to their makeshift tattered flag, they are off. The Confederates have won the first battle of the Civil War. As a result of the Battle of Fort Sumter and the undeniable start of what would be a long and gruesome bloody domestic war, Union President Abraham Lincoln puts out a call on April 15 for 75,000 militia volunteers to stop what he refers to as an illegitimate rebellion. This act triggers the remaining Confederate states to officially leave the Union. Lincoln doubles down by calling for an additional 40,000 men to serve for a 3-year span. Jefferson Davis, leader of the Confederate States, counters with a call for an additional 100,000 militiamen of his own, proposing a 12-month service. At this point in time, neither side wants the war to last long. In fact, some in the South actually hope that the attack on Fort Sumter will scare the Union into diplomacy instead of an armed conflict. The Confederates know they are greatly outnumbered and recognize the obstacles they need to overcome to beat the North. However, they aren't the only ones with concerning weaknesses. Over in the Union, many of Lincoln's cabinet and his own generals question his ability to lead the nation through a war. Yet Lincoln's generals themselves are their own problem. Many have grown old or unhealthy and nearly incapable altogether, leaving the president with great difficulty when it comes to choosing who will lead his armies. Nevertheless, armies need to be led and plans need to be made. As for what the North has in store for the South, one must look at the Union's Anaconda Plan. Lieutenant General Winfield Scott is the man responsible for providing this strategy. While it is only partially used by the end of the war, Scott precisely predicts the approach of his nation's tactics. It is his idea that the Union should focus on a strong defense of Washington, D.C., an unforgiving blockade of the South from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and a brutal land and sea attack along the Mississippi River to sever the Confederacy in two. Named for its attempt to strangle the South into submission, the Anaconda Plan seems doable, but the strategy on paper is shelved early into the war due to political pressure Lincoln hopes to ease. By the end of May, the Union crosses the Potomac and takes hold of Arlington Heights. This sets off the start of intermittent skirmishes that carry on throughout the war between each of the major battles, with the first of the latter on Virginian soil coming in early June at the Battle of Big Bethel. The forces of the Confederates and the United States meet at the village of Big Bethel on June 10, 1861. The North hopes to create a buffer for themselves around Fort Monroe, one of the last Union strongholds in the area. This ultimately fails, leading to another Confederate victory. Around this time, the Wheeling Convention results in the northwestern counties of Virginia voting to break free from their current state and begin the process of forming the new state of West Virginia, which will ally with the North. With momentum in their sails, the Union decides it is time to begin the main objective: take Richmond and end the war once and for all. As General Irvin McDowell begins the march with his 35,000 men, the largest field army yet gathered on the continent, cheering civilians follow the troops with picnic baskets and unwavering excitement. The Northerners believe their men are marching into an assured victory that will collapse the Confederacy. What happens instead is the Battle of Bull Run. McDowell's troops are made up almost entirely of men who responded to the call to arms following the assault on Fort Sumter, meaning they lack experience or an understanding of what they are about to face. McDowell leads them to seize a crucial railroad junction at Manassas, just near the Bull Run stream. It is here that the Confederate forces sit waiting to defend, playing into McDowell's plan to confront the Confederate force in the front and right flank to push them into abandoning the junction. As the Union Army approaches, the Confederate Army of the Potomac under General Pierre G.T. Beauregard requests aid from Richmond, intended to be answered by reinforcements by the Army of the Shenandoah under General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston, though, is being stalled by the Union force of 18,000 men under Major General Robert Patterson, tasked with preventing the Army of the Shenandoah from reaching Bull Run. Meanwhile, McDowell gets closer to Beauregard's defenses. As they inch near, McDowell sends roughly 5,000 of his men with Brigadier General Theodore Runyon to guard the rear, while another division under Brigadier General Daniel Tyler is dispatched to try and hit the Confederate right flank. This results in a small-scale clash between Tyler's force and the Confederates at Blackburn's Ford, where the Northerners are beaten back. Over with Patterson, the Union troops aren't doing much better either. Despite sending a telegraph to D.C. saying he succeeded in keeping Johnston's forces at Winchester, he hasn't. Instead, when Johnston receives word of Beauregard's situation, he utilizes a cavalry screen to give Patterson the slip and leave Winchester. This is bad news for McDowell, who currently outnumbers the Confederate force he faces by more than 10,000. If Johnston can make it to Bull Run before the battle is over, which the Union general soon hears is a strong possibility, the dynamic will change drastically. The clash begins on the morning of July 21, 1861. McDowell sends 2 divisions from Centerville towards Sudley Springs in hopes of ambushing the Confederate left flank, while another division is sent as a distraction to the Stone Bridge, intending to deceive the Southerners. This plan seems doable in theory, but in reality, inexperienced men and poor execution mean the Union soldiers fumbled the ball. Colonel Nathan Evans of the Confederates, defending the bridge, determines that the attack on his force is only a distraction and swiftly reacts, racing with the main fragment of his troops to Matthews Hill to meet up with the real Union attack. While he is unable to stop McDowell due to his inferior numbers, Evans successfully stalls the Northerners while reinforcements come his way. Although these reinforcements soon collapse under Union pressure, the Confederate defense is failing and its men are on the run. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians, General Bernard B. shouts to his beaten down and nearly deserting men as Johnston and Beauregard arrive at Henry House Hill. The Union troops hesitate and reorganize their advance, giving the Southerners time to do the same. After an hour, the battle is back on, and the tides begin to notably change. Confederate forces are able to capture Union artillery guns, and the Northern offensive falls apart. The rebel yell rings out as the Union troops are one by one pushed off of Henry House Hill. By 4 p.m., the Confederates have won. After losing their position, the Northerners begin what would at first be an organized retreat. Within the hour, however, any form of organization goes out the window. The Southerners follow the fleeing enemy and turn the respectable defeat for the Union into an undeniable rout. Though some of the Northern troops arrive home to Washington by the next day, their campaign has been crushed. The weight of such a catastrophic and embarrassing loss is violently damaging for President Lincoln's reputation, but there is even more going against him by now. As the fighting gets into full swing, the Union president's wartime decisions begin to appear tyrannical to some. A crackdown on dissension isn't entirely unpredictable, but proves to be an infringement on the First Amendment rights of many Americans. Mail, telegraphs, and the press become regularly censored, and at times even silenced. Meanwhile, anyone openly showing support for the Confederates is at risk of being arrested. Even a Democratic congressman, Clement L. Vallandigham, is arrested in his own home state for speaking out against the war, while the office of the nonconformist Sunday Chronicle is destroyed by government officials. All of this makes many start to think about ideas such as impeachment, but as Lincoln builds up his defenses around D.C., both metaphorically and physically, opposition is left in the dark. Meanwhile, pressure from abolitionist activists is increasing. Thus far, Lincoln's main concern is the restoration of the Union, but many freed slaves turned activists are cranking up the heat on the president with the goal of pushing him to make the war about abolition and emancipation, not just winning back the Confederates. Honest Abe, however, isn't yet ready to change the focus of the war and instead signs off on the Congress-passed Confiscation Act of 1861. This act gives the federal government the authority to seize property from anyone deemed to be participating in the rebellion, property including but not limited to slaves. These fugitive slaves are classed as contraband and are often then utilized to work as laborers on Union infrastructure, far from making the war about emancipation. 4 days after Congress passes the first Confiscation Act, the battle is back on. Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon is about to come face-to-face with Brigadier General Ben McCulloch and Major General Sterling Price of the Confederacy in Springfield, Missouri, for what would be known as the Battle of Wilson's Creek. This is the first major clash of the Civil War west of the Mississippi, and one of the fewer times that the Union forces are actually outnumbered. In an almost amusingly ironic twist, it turns out that both sides, as of August 9th, are planning to ambush one another. Both of these plans specifically hinge on the element of surprise, with neither knowing what the other is intending. General Lyon's tactic is to send 1,200 men under Colonel Franz Sigel wide around the Confederate right to the south, while the remaining force involved swings north and hits the Southerners' left. The latter, however, actually have a similar plan, but a stroke of luck and rain causes General McCulloch to abandon his plans. This leaves the element of surprise fully in the hands of the Northerners. The marching of the Union breaks the silence of the morning calm on August 10. Lyon's plan, unlike McCulloch's, is still on, and it has begun. The Confederate forces are utterly dumbfounded by the ambush they failed to anticipate. A surprise offensive from the Union troops allows the latter's advance to play out at a swift pace. Lyon and his men are able to advance all the way to what would soon be known as Bloody Hill before being stalled by the Pulaski, Arkansas Battery's defensive attack. While the Pulaski Battery keeps the Northerners from advancing further, General Price and his men regroup and head for the hill, where a gruesome battle subsequently breaks out. For nearly 6 hours, the battle rages. The Union began the clash with a clear strategic advantage, but as the warfare on Bloody Hill carries on, the tide begins to shift in favor of the Confederates. McCulloch is eventually pitted against Sigel at Sharp's Farm, where the Northerners' thus far triumphant flanking maneuver is crushed by the counterattack from the Southerners so badly that Sigel and his troops abruptly retreat. Meanwhile, Lyon's luck is fading even more drastically. Already weakened by wounds he obtained in the prior hours of ruthless battle, Lyon is eventually struck down by the South, requiring a hasty transfer of command to Major Samuel Sturgis. The Northerners' new leader isn't incompetent, but victory for him by now seems impossible. With scarcely any ammunition left before the clocks even strike noon, the Union is in a full retreat back to Springfield. A few weeks after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, the Union finally gets a win, but this time by sea. The Confederates for some time now have been authorizing privateering along the Carolina coast, which predictably triggers a military response from the Union. This reaction, however, is poorly anticipated by the Southerners at two forts in particular, Fort Clark and Fort Hatteras. This results in both partially constructed forts falling into Union hands after a naval bombardment forces the troops manning Fort Clark to flee for Fort Hatteras, which itself soon surrenders. It is a much-needed victory for the North, but it is followed by an even worse defeat. The Confederates are about to take Lexington. General Price and his 15,000 men reach Lexington, Missouri on September 11, 1861. Small-scale battle begins the next day as the Union forces attempt to stop the Confederate advance, but Price is better prepared and surely determined. It doesn't take long for the Southerners to pin their opponent down in the college housing the Union fortifications. Although the remaining Northerners can't be beaten out or into surrender by the Confederates, a 2-hour artillery battle and delayed supplies cause Price to hold off continuing the offensive temporarily. "It is unnecessary to kill off the boys here. Patience will give us what we want," he explains. Less than a week later, on September 18th, it seems Price is satisfied with the patience shown thus far. Despite strong Union artillery, the Confederates advance at long last, bottling up the defenders once more. 9 hours of cannon fire ensue. Meanwhile, the Southerners are additionally in the process of capturing the nearby Anderson House, which is in use as a Union hospital for wounded soldiers. This stunning potential war crime, at least in the eyes of the Union, prompts the Northerners to storm and retake the house, but control then falls back to the Confederates more permanently. 2 days later, the city as a whole falls into Southern hands. The following month sees yet another embarrassing defeat for the Union, as distrust of the president and his abilities are on the rise. After some poorly executed reconnaissance across the Potomac River over in Virginia, a decision is made to launch another Union attack, this time under the command of Abraham Lincoln's dear friend, Colonel Edward Baker. This foray proves to be an utter disaster due to horrendous planning and execution. Baker himself is slain, and his men, all positioned precariously at the edge of Ball's Bluff, essentially cornered by the Confederates, either flee or are killed, with many leaping to their deaths off the bluff. Many of those who do escape furthermore drown trying to cross the icy river. The generals who had been involved in the campaign, General Charles Stone and even General George McClellan, are heavily scrutinized. Stone is eventually blamed and charged with treason as a result. McClellan, however, is distant enough from the disaster itself and is eventually promoted to General-in-Chief of all Union armies, despite deep mistrust between himself and the president. Distrust is building between Washington, D.C. and its overseas counterparts now as well. Particularly, the bonds between the Union and Great Britain seem to be dwindling, and on November 8th they appear nearly non-existent. Britain thus far has been acting a bit sympathetic to the South, largely because they missed the crucial cotton exports from the now Confederate states. As a result, communication between the two entities leads President Jefferson Davis to dispatch 2 envoys over to the British mail ship, the Trent, to try and garner official support and recognition of the Confederacy. Unbeknownst to Washington, on November 8, 1861, the month after the envoys joined the British on their ship, U.S. Captain Charles Wilkes intercepts the Trent. The captain then has his lieutenant board the ship to search it, at which point the Confederate envoys are detained, and the Brits told that they can leave on their own. This triggers a hailstorm from Britain, which deems the acts of Captain Wilkes to have been both a violation of British neutrality as well as a blatant violation of international law. Eventually, under the demand of Great Britain and due to an unwillingness to go to war with their former overlords, D.C. agrees to release the prisoners and toils to resolve the situation diplomatically. While this works for the time being, it is only the start of British influence on what the Union is willing to do to win the war.